Good evening. Thank you so much for your patience in starting. I know we're getting into things a little bit late here. I do want to preface that, this webinar was initially planned to talk about sleep. Unfortunately, the doctor who was going to speak on sleep medicine has canceled at the last minute, so we are unable to provide that content for you right now. However, I do have Dr. Jessica Ridgley here, and she has some wonderful things prepared regarding food medicine and nutrition. So please feel free to stick around if that is also a subject that interests you. I apologize for any inconvenience for waiting and not getting the advertised content. But without that, let's continue on. So my name is Stacy, and I work for the communications department at the Douglas County Schools District. And right now I encourage you to take an active participating role in this webinar by going to slido.com and entering in the code SLEEP or scanning the QR code on your screen. This will enable you to ask questions during the Q&A, and it will also we'll also have some polls throughout tonight's webinar. So I want to introduce our presenter for tonight, Dr. Jessica Ridgley. Dr. Ridgley's passion in medicine is all about utilizing nutrition and manual therapies to improve overall health and well-being. And working in a clinic-based practice, she enjoys partnering with patients and working with them to improve their health through a holistic approach. And I'm super excited for what she has for us tonight. So, Dr. Ridgley, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit more? I think I only got the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, sure. So I work at Lone Tree Internal Medicine. It's now called Skyridge Primary Care Lone Tree. And I've been working here for about 3 years. I do internal medicine, which is my main board certification. I am also board certified in osteopathic manipulation and neuromuscular medicine, which is a little slightly different thing from a lot of physicians. And I just finished my fellowship in integrative medicine, which if for any of you who may not really know what that is, it's integrating other aspects of medicine, such as Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and botanicals and different things into more of a Western medicine type of field. And so I kind of integrate all of those together in my practice on a daily basis.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Shall we get going?
Sure.
All right, and folks, we'll have about a 30-minute presentation here with 15 minutes or more to ask questions of Dr. Ridgley. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to view publicly on the DCSD YouTube channel. And as attendees, you will also receive a direct link to this particular webinar. So hold on just one moment. We're going to get this going. All right, take it away, Dr. Ridgley.
All right, so I already kind of said who I was with the nutrition. And so nutrition is definitely a passion of mine. I think it's really important because there's so much information out in the marketplace about what's good and what's not good, and all the different diets that are available, that it's kind of hard to sift through all the information and know what is good information and what isn't good information. So with this talk, I was really wanting to kind of hone in on some of the real basic stuff that is just absolute truth, scientifically proven. There's no need to worry about that. And also to dispel a few myths about kind of what's out there. So, I do hope that after this talk that there will be some questions, but I love to talk about nutrition. So next slide. I don't have any disclosures, so I don't have any attachments to any other outside companies outside of Health One. Next slide. All right, so let's start out by talking about the standard American diet, which in the more functional medicine and the integrative fields, a lot of us refer to it as the SAD diet. It really is kind of a sad diet. It's something that most of us at this point as adults have grown up with. It kind of started to get into this around the 70s and really progressed. And then we ended up having a lot of different things that have happened that, have kind of converted us and tried to change the way that we would eat. But we really are stuck in this kind of high carbohydrate, lot of processed foods, easy fast foods because our lifestyles are so hectic. But in that, it's also high sodium. It's very high in trans fats, which is very inflammatory to the body. There's a lot of artificial dyes and ingredients, which can end up causing issues, especially with our young ones in their young, intestinal tracts. It can cause them to become more sensitive to other types of foods and things like that. The other problem with this SAD diet is that it's very low in fiber. We've known for the last 100 years that fiber decreases, some cancers, that it improves cardiovascular disease, and that the recommended amount is around 25 to 30 grams, but the average person gets about 15. So in the United States, and that becomes a bit of an issue as far as that's concerned. The SAD diet is also very low in omega-3s. I think that's more of a common term in the kind of the marketplace now with fish oil and things like that. And there's a lot of little myths about omega-3s that I would like to dispel, but the SAD diet is definitely lower in omega-3s, and omega-3s are very important to our body. And then overall, it's low in micronutrients. When I say it's low in nutrition, it does not have a lot of those little things that we need. I mean, we all kind of know about proteins, fats, and carbs, but we don't really know as much about the many different vitamins and minerals that are absolutely essential to our body. And with the higher carbohydrates, if the carbohydrates are more from the processed foods, then it's not very high in those important micronutrients. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that too. The standard American diet is just one that we've kind of linked ourselves into, and it's pretty interesting overall trying to kind of back our way out of that. But hopefully this talk will give you guys some insight into some ways to improve whatever kind of diet that you guys have. So next slide. All right, so now that we've talked about the standard American diet, the anti-inflammatory diet is the one diet that is been found to be super helpful in almost every chronic disease out there. And when we're talking about our kids, it is the type of disease that it's the type of diet that we really want to instill in our kids in wanting to eat, because it's what's going to serve them best throughout their entire life. The anti-inflammatory diet, there's a lot of different diets that are considered in that. It's definitely a whole food based diet. One of the most common ones that a lot of people have heard about is the Mediterranean diet, very high in omega-3 fatty acids and even polyunsaturated fatty acids. And I will get into the dispelling myths of fats later, but it definitely is a little higher in fat than we're used to hearing is okay in our society. Very high in fish. It's high, and it even recommends having some alcohol for adults. And it's overall just a very healthy diet. It's been studied in multiple different chronic diseases and been found to be helpful in almost every single one it's been tested in. And a couple of others that are similar is the Okinawan diet. Most people don't really know about that one. That's more an Asian-based diet. But the Okinawan culture was studied because of its longevity, and they found that to be very healthy. And then another one that a lot of people have heard about is the paleo diet. People may have heard of it from the Whole30, but that is also an excellent diet when it comes to anti-inflammatory if adhered to as it states. Like I said, the anti-inflammatory diets are very high in healthy fats, which for our children is super important for a developing brain. It is excellent in good protein. That's also another thing that I find with the standard American diet, and something that does not put a lot of emphasis, is that protein is actually pretty low in most of our diets. So I'm going to go over what would be considered to be appropriate amount. And so that's, super important to make sure that our protein is in a good level. And considering most of our diets are pretty high in carbohydrates, not everybody, but a lot, that protein is something to put a little bit more emphasis on. And then when we do talk about carbohydrates, it's those healthy carbohydrates that are going to help sustain us long term. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. And like I said, it has been scientifically found to be helpful. So next slide. So the first thing that I wanted to start off with, because it is the most essential nutrient that our body needs, is water. And it's in and around us every day, and many of us do forget about it. And so I did want to talk about what our basic daily needs are. So when it comes to adults and teenagers, so that would be pretty much anybody from about 13, 14 upward, we're talking about 8 to 11 cups per day. And, 8 is the one that we typically hear about, that's 64 ounces. But those 11, when we're talking about where we live, such as Colorado, it is a very dry climate. So we have insensible water losses that we're not as aware about. So it does help to actually get a little bit more than the 64 ounces here in Colorado. And also for our kids who do a lot of sports, it's really important to increase our water intake to match that loss of water that they're getting when they're sweating. So, and then when we're talking about preteens, so that's typically around 9 to about 12 or 13. We're talking about 7 or 8 cups of water. So that's around that 56 to 64 ounces. And then for our younger children, so usually under 9, basically around 4 to 9 or so, we're looking at about 4 to 8 cups of water per day. And then when it comes to toddlers, we're talking about 2 to 4 cups. The other thing I would like to say about water, because, there's a lot of things out there about whether tap water is safe or whether it's not, whether it's better to drink drink water out of plastic and that kind of thing. So one of the things that I give out in my clinic is a handout on toxins, and water is a big one when it comes to that. And a website that I do really favor a lot is the EWG, or the Environmental Working Group website. And you can actually go on there and look up your water source for your town that you live in. And it'll let you know not only what the EPA standard is and whether your water does follow those, but it'll also give you what they have found to be the safest requirements, and if it is over that in any way. But when we're talking about that, so I do recommend actually filtering tap water for your cooking needs and for drinking. What I do not recommend is actually getting it from plastic. Plastic is another toxin, which is not, I did not include in this talk, but is actually very toxic to us and actually can disrupt our hormones. So that's kind of something none of us want. So I don't really recommend that. But I do recommend a good carbon filter. You can easily get a carbon filter from the store. As long as you get a higher grade carbon filter, it actually filters out about 70% of different toxins that you might find in the water. So definitely want good, clean water when we're talking about water requirements, but it's not too hard to get that if we're getting a good carbon filter to do so. Next slide. All right, so back to fiber. I decided the second one to talk about was fiber because there seems to be a lot of issues with most people getting enough fiber. Unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan, which most of those people do get enough fiber. But for a lot of people in the United States, we don't. Typically, we're at around 15 grams or less per day. And when we're talking about that, it's very important for our kids. Between water and fiber for their bowel movements and for a good healthy gut, fiber is extremely important. It also helps to detoxify the body by pulling in toxins through the colon. So fiber is is actually extremely important. And the typical amount that we should get is for 9-year-olds and older. So now we're looking at more of those preteens all the way through adults, is about 25 to 35 grams per day. And that is obviously dependent on kind of body mass. So, usually a woman should be getting around 25 grams per day and men should be getting around 30 to 35 and, or 25 to 30 for women and 30 to 35 for men. And then when it comes to your kids, you're talking around probably 20 to 20, 25 or so is really important, even in those younger years from the 9 to 13. And then once they're in that teenage years, it still goes to that 25 to 25 to 35, depending on their kind of height and weight. And then our 4 to 8-year-olds, they should be getting around 25 grams per day. And then the toddlers about 19 grams per day. I already kind of talked about, kind of the importance of making sure that we're getting enough water and fiber for gut health. So that's really important. And then from the adult perspective, they recently changed the requirements for colon cancer screening from 50 to 45 because we were seeing more and more people in those younger years with colon cancer. And a lot of that has to do with, lack of a good diet, and part of that is low fiber. So definitely want to make sure that we're getting more fruits and vegetables. And one of the dispelling myths that I'd like to talk about with fiber is that although grains are, whole grains are actually do have some good things for us, that is not actually the best place to get fiber. It is not the most efficient. To give kind of an example, we can get about two pieces of bread. Say we're getting a whole grain bread. That's going to be about 200 calories and about 4 grams of fiber. Or if we did a half a cup of blueberries, we have 4 grams of fiber right there and only about 50 calories. So, and honestly, I think it's a little bit tastier, but that's to each their own. But the fruits and vegetables are super important for getting that fiber. All right, next slide. All right, so now let's go a little bit into protein, fats, and carbs. And these are our macronutrients. These are the things that we absolutely need for our body health. And micronutrients are the same, but these are kind of our foundation. And so I have an analogy that I share with my patients. Protein is like that foundation to your body. Without protein and those amino acids that break down when we eat them and then get reconstructed as our body tissue, then we really don't have the ability to have a good, healthy body. So we're going to go more into proteins and what the recommended amount for proteins would be. Next slide. Oh, we went too far ahead. We need to go back about 2 slides. One more. All right, proteins plus, all right, the next slide. All right, protein plus fats. And this is where fats come in. Fats are super important. Usually protein and fats work together, and that's like the structure of our house, that structure of our body. We have that foundation that everything kind of sits on, and then we have the proteins and fats that kind of make up the structure of our body. Next slide. And then we have carbohydrates. And, like I said before, the SAD diet is very high in carbohydrates. And not always good carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically our electricity. And although electricity is super important, obviously we wouldn't be able to run without it. If we don't have that foundation and that structure to build off of, then the carbohydrates really don't provide a whole lot. So go ahead, next slide. All right, let's talk about protein. So protein is one thing that I find in my clinic when I'm talking about nutrition is very low in a lot of people's diets. It's because we don't really put a lot of emphasis on it. It's just assumed that we're going to get it. And that's not always the case. So talking about this, in the studies that have been found by the CDC, about 1 in 3 individuals get enough protein. So 1/3 of us is not getting enough protein. And so the good question is, like, what is enough protein? And 1 gram per kilogram ideal body weight is typically what a person needs. So whether it is your child, whether it's you, is about 1 gram per kilogram of ideal body weight. And then if we're talking an athlete, so whether your kid is, playing, actively involved in sports and doing a lot of sports when they're 5 or 15, or whether we're 25 years old or older, we still need more, because you're breaking down muscle and you need those amino acids to actually rebuild that muscle and to establish improvement in our athletic capacity. So where 1 gram per kilogram ideal body weight is pretty, is what I would recommend for most people, kind of doing the normal activities, not really doing really high intensity or high activity type of things. If a person, whether they be a child or an adult, is doing higher activity, then I do recommend to actually get a little bit more. And so if you're doing more of a moderate, like 3 times a week type of thing, 1.25 grams per kilogram, or if you're like a really high intense type of athlete, or your child is doing athletics 4 to 5 times a week, then I would recommend actually increasing that to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight. And then I put, food options. I wanted to make sure that people could see that it's not all just animal. There's also fish, and there's beans. Are actually beans and legumes in general are very high in a lot of the essential amino acids. So you don't have to have meat to get that. And that's very important to know. But it is very important if you are going to stay more into, if you're going to stay more into the kind of the vegetarian options, to make sure that you're getting those things such as the legumes and quinoa, definitely rice, which I don't recommend a ton of rice. And if somebody wants to talk to me about that, we can talk more about that, and I'll tell you why. But rice with the legumes is actually a complete protein. But that's really important in any kind of vegetarian or vegan diet. So next slide. All right, let's talk about fats. Are they good or are they bad? That is actually a trick question, because it is neither. They are absolutely essential to our body. There are some thoughts, not fully proven, but some thoughts that one of the reasons Alzheimer's disease has increased is because we went through this period in the 80s and continues, that we believe that fats are not good for us and people have gone on a low-fat diet. One of the stories I like to tell about fats is that many of us probably went, we're either young in the 80s, and some of us do remember the 80s. And there was this period of time where everything went low fat, and they kind of put a lot of carbohydrates and sugars to take out, to kind of fill in that fat void and that taste perspective. And it came across because in the 50s, there was 2 scientists who were doing studies on cardiovascular disease, and they were told to find out what is in our diet that is causing our cardiovascular disease to be so bad. And so they found out that sugar was actually the number 1 culprit. And then the second culprit, that in especially animal fats, certain types of animal fats, were the second culprit. So there was no fat industry, but there was definitely a sugar industry. And the sugar industry came in and said, hey, we'll pay you so much to not put that sugar is the main issue. And so they took the money and they put out that fats were the main issue that caused cardiovascular disease. And then everything went low fat, and shockingly, nothing really changed when it came to cardiovascular disease. So sugars are definitely probably the number 1 culprit of a lot of our chronic diseases and the inflammation that can happen. But fats are definitely not as bad as we have been taught in our society. As a matter of fact, omega-3 fatty acids are absolutely essential. They're found in every cell of the body. And last, I believe it was studied, when we look at the balance between omega-3s and omega-6s in our diets, it's about 20 to 1, and it should actually be 1 to 1, where it's omega-3 and omega-6 1 to 1. So omega-3s are pretty low in our diet. They're absolutely essential for our kids' development and for health and growth, brain growth. So, schoolwork and everything like that. So that's super important. I actually, and this is just the brand that I use for my kids. I use Core Omega for my kids, because they seem to like the fact that they don't have to take a pill and it is flavored like orange. So, so that's just one brand that I find to be pretty good for giving to kids. And then when we talk about polyunsaturated fats from plants, those are absolutely essential as well. We're going to find those from avocados, and we're going to find them from nuts. And then medium chain triglycerides are from coconut. There's a lot of other places you can find medium chain triglycerides. And those are pretty interesting because those typically bypass the normal fat storage and can be utilized almost immediately for energy sources. So there's definitely some bad fats. The more processed we get, so if we're talking about bacon or sausage or some of our meats or our fast foods, yeah, those are not good fats. I do not recommend them. But when it comes to a lot of our plant fats, those are essential for us. They're excellent for us. Definitely also the fish oils. And the other thing I like to say about omega-3s is that there's a myth that you can't get it from other types of meats, and that's not true. If a cow is grass fed, they actually do build up omega-3s. If a chicken is pasture raised and fed flaxseed, then they also have omega-3s, and wild meats are actually high in omega-3s too. They're not quite as high as fish, but there is some omega-3s in those other options. So next slide, please. All right, carbohydrates, the thing we love the most. So carbohydrates are absolutely essential from, that energy perspective, like I talked about. But when we're talking about carbohydrates, we really want to focus on those really healthy carbohydrates and not those sugars that seem to be kind of in almost everything these days. So when I talk about added sugars, I talk about making sure that we maintain under 40 grams per day. If the child is about, you can kind of go by size on that. So, by the time we're talking like 9 years old or older, I think that 30, 40 grams is pretty consistent. If the child is younger, we're talking even like 20 to 30 grams per day of having sugars. It's pretty important. Those added sugars like sucrose are just not absolutely needed in our body. It can definitely cause a lot of inflammation. So that's definitely something that we like to limit. And then when we're talking about grains, one thing I will say about grains is that, our genetics really haven't changed in the last 20,000 years. And it was about 10,000 years ago that grains became really popular because farming became popular. And so when we think about that, our genetics really aren't wired for grains, but grains being plants, if they're whole grain, actually do exhibit a lot of good nutrition. So when you're talking about whole grains, it's definitely, something to consider for 2 to 3 servings of grain daily. It's not really recommended to have more than that, even in the Mediterranean diet, which does talk about grains. And definitely whole grains and not the refined flours that we typically have in our markets today. And then 70% of your fruits and vegetables, or 70% of your carbohydrates should come from fruits and vegetables. We kind of talked about that before. And when we talk about carbohydrates in the diet, everybody's a little bit different on their needs in carbohydrates. But what can definitely be a good number is about 30 to 40% of carbohydrates in each diet, regardless of size. That's percentage wise, that's a really good kind of guide. So it also is important to note that because it is our energy, if we do have a young athlete, that carbohydrates are very important before practices and before their games. But when we're talking about the types, getting them, a grain versus, giving them a sandwich versus giving them a banana, the banana is going to give them a lot more benefit from that perspective. But it is important to kind of around those times to make sure that the carbohydrates are a little bit higher. Next slide, please. All right, so originally I was planning on being the one guiding this, and so I put some general rules in here that are going to slide in. So I will talk about the rule and then say click the next one. So if you could click, I would appreciate that. All right. So the first rule is everything in moderation. When I say that sugars have to be low, it still doesn't mean that every once in a while when we have that special event that we really shouldn't be able to give ourselves a little bit of leeway. And, some people will go into this thing of like really low fat or really high fat. And although, I can have long conversations about the keto diet and some benefits and negativities of that. Everything in moderation when it comes to a lifestyle diet is very important. Next rule. Eat until you're only 3/4 full. And this is actually a rule that comes from the Okinawan culture. They basically state from youth growing up that you don't eat until you are full, you eat until you're 3/4 full, because by that time you're probably are full and you're just not registering it. So it's a really good rule to just eat until you're about 3/4 full. Next rule. Stay hydrated. We talked about this with water. It's very, very important to make sure that you stay hydrated. They actually did a study with that about rehydrating after you sleep and showed many benefits physiologically when we start to rehydrate and staying hydrated throughout the day. Next rule. If it's in a commercial or a box, you think twice before buying it. So I do think that that's legitimate. There's definitely some things that are out there in a commercial that are probably good, but you can typically know which ones are good and which ones aren't. But if it's coming from a box in the grocery store, I'm not saying to not get some things that are easier for us to make, because I think all of us have those little go-tos, but definitely staying more into that whole foods and using less boxes is definitely important. Next, please. Shop the perimeter. So this might be something that some of you have heard when it comes to grocery stores. If you think about the setup of a grocery store, you usually come in and there's vegetables right there. And then in the back part, there's the meat. And then you also have the dairy and other things. And it's typically the more processed foods that you find in the middle. The only leeway I would give on this one is that usually some of the nutrient aisles are actually packed with some good things, and those aren't in the perimeter. But other than that, it is a really good rule to shop the perimeter as much as possible when it comes to buying our groceries and making decisions on what we're eating. Next slide. Next. Yeah. Farm to table is always best. Now, saying that, it is really difficult to do for a lot of people. But if you do have some people who you can get more, if you're having meat and you can get it from, closer to the farm or go to the farmer's market, that is always a little bit better than going to the grocery store. It's definitely going to be a little bit more nutrient dense. And so that's just something to think about, of ways to kind of get your food a little bit closer to its source. Next, please. So, and for optimal nutrition, I do believe that it is best to be on a whole food based vitamin. I will say that, there's been studies that go either way on this one. But when I think about our ancestors and the fact that our genetics haven't changed for 20,000 years, and yet those people back then were spending a lot more calories than we do, we can't eat that many calories or we would have problems. So we're looking at still having the requirements for many of these nutrients, and many times to essentially be healthy, we can't always eat the same amount that they ate. And the other aspect of that is that there's a difference between the recommended daily allowance and the optimal daily allowance. So when it comes to my patients, I do talk about that, taking a multivitamin to get to that recommended daily allowance and allowing the good food that we eat to bring us up to that optimal daily allowance. Because the recommended daily allowance, although it says recommended, is really that level in which you don't want to go under, or you're going to start having signs for diseases and other issues. Next, please. All right. So kind of sending this off with a little bit of a joke. And I really appreciate your attention and I look forward to your questions.
I said you're the good kind of fat. That's great. All right, I'm going to jump on over here to some of my slides. Thank you so much for sharing all of this, Dr. Ridgley. I feel like, since spring has just arrived, this is the perfect time to start thinking about fresh foods and exactly how we can start incorporating those into our diets. It's certainly my favorite season for fresh foods. All right, all. So we did have a few people submit questions through Slido. If you would still like to do so, you can head to slido.com and enter in the code SLEEP. But we'll just go on through these and answer them as we can. So let's start with the first one. I would like to know more about why you don't suggest rice in our diets.
So it's not that I don't suggest rice. It's just that things that, and this is included in some root vegetables as well, that actually rice picks up arsenic pretty easily from the ground. And so depending on the rice, it can be a little higher in that arsenic. Our bodies do have a natural capacity to detoxify arsenic, the natural arsenic from the ground. But if we're talking about higher amounts of rice and we're getting that higher amount, then many times we are not able to detoxify as efficiently as we need to. And so I don't recommend, basically what I'm saying is I don't recommend having rice like for every night at dinner. Definitely to vary it. Rice does have some great benefits. Like I said, it does have the ability to provide the other essential amino acids with the legumes to make a complete protein in your diet. I just don't recommend it having it heavily in your diet.
All right, here's one that I can agree with. I'm addicted to sugar. What should I do to break the cravings? Does sugar cause inflammation in the body?
Sugar, that is such a great question. Sugar is so inflammatory to the body. Dr. Hyman, whom I love his stuff, he actually talks about sugar being more addictive than cocaine, which I am not sure they've proven that, or nor do I know if it's truly more addictive, but I know from my personal perspective that it sometimes feels that way. So there's a really good question about how to break those cravings. I have found with my patients and with myself that when we're trying to break that craving, it is actually a great idea to do a no added sugar diet for about a month. And that is super hard. But it actually does shift the way we taste things. So if you were able to do that no added sugar for that full month, when you go back, if you try to eat something that has the normal amount of sugar that you used to love, you'll be like, wow, that is so sweet. So honestly, I think one of the best ways to just break an addiction to sugar is to just stop it and try. And then after that month, like I said, I believe in everything in moderation. I'm not sure you absolutely have to stay completely off of sugar, but it's important to just try to maintain that less than 40 grams daily. And then those, allow yourself those times either once per week or every once in a while, or vacations where we just don't worry so much about it, because we can get a little too crazy about staying on certain things. So I think the best way is just to stop it for a while.
Is there a website you trust that has an accurate list of grams of fiber per serving of fruits, vegetable, beans, etc.?
I don't. I look things up randomly, and usually if you say fiber in foods and you just Google that, especially if you hit images, you'll usually have something come up that has a pretty good amount. Most of them are pretty standard.
Mm-hmm. Are there like trusted resources that you generally point patients to?
When it comes, honestly, like I'm trying to think, it's a really good question. I know earlier I talked about the environmental working group. That's definitely not nutrition based. Actually, yeah, there's Dr. I would say any of some of the integrative medicine sites, Dr. Andy Weil's site. He has a wonderful abundance of information on his site, including nutrition and the anti-inflammatory diet. And he does bend a little bit to the Mediterranean diet, but I he has just a ton of great information. I mean, you could probably search on there for different things for days. So that would probably be one that I would trust to make sure had really accurate information about nutrition.
And that's Dr. Andrew Weil,
Mm-hmm. Dr. Andrew Weil, Weil.
Weil. Okay. All right. Have someone asking if drinking water from plastic water bottles can affect children's hormones.
Yes, that is a really good question. So the one that we know and that we get concerned about is BPA. But then we have BPS and BPF and all these other ones that have come up because BPA was not optional. And they've actually found that they're just as bad, if not worse than BPA. So some of those hard plastic bottles that we like to use that say are BPA free still may have BPS or BPF in it. And they can still mess with hormones. And we're talking more of the sex hormones. So they are very estrogenic in the body because many times when our body takes in toxins and it doesn't know what to do with it, the liver takes it on and it turns it into a compound that looks somewhat estrogenic in nature. So we end up creating these issues when we're dealing with plastic water bottles. So and honestly, for the health of our earth as well, I do not recommend plastic water bottles. I recommend getting the metal water bottles and carbon filtering water.
All right. And so this question, I don't know how much you can speak to this, Dr. Ridgley, but why don't the nutritional values of school lunches offered match these recommendations that you're making?
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay.
I think that Michelle Obama tried to get that to be a little bit better. I think that they have to, one of the things is they have to offer a lot of different options and not always. I mean, I know for elementary, they don't really, but I think it has to do with just what is normal in our diet and trying to change that standard. I wish I had more insights into that, but I will be honest, I send my kids to school with school lunches most often because of.
And I know that our nutrition services is always open to engaging and answering questions and hearing feedback. So
Absolutely.
So we are getting a little bit low on time. Let's do these 3 questions that's on our page right here. So what do you think of the DASH Plus diet?
So the DASH Plus diet is a very anti-inflammatory diet. I mean, it's been found to be a very good diet overall from that perspective. I think you could probably bring that up along with the Mediterranean diet.
Right,
I didn't.
Sorry. What are your thoughts on genetically modified foods and how you can avoid them?
All right, that's a really deep question. I am not a fan of genetically modified foods. And the problem is that almost everything that you eat that has corn in it is going to be genetically modified to some degree because of the way that there is the breeding within corn and the hybridization. So even if it is organic and somebody is trying and there is another field out there that is genetically modified, they will interbreed and you will have seeds that have both in there. So, and that's just one example of kind of how that works. So it is really hard to stay away from them completely. My thought is to actually look at, there is the GMO certification that I would say you would have to look at if you really want to be hardcore about that. And that is not something that is government run. That is actually something that is privately run on foods that decide to go and get that certification. So whoever's providing that food actually has to go and request that certification and they test it. So the best way to do it is to look for that label. And then when it comes to the vegetable aisle, I mean, you can't know 100% with the vegetable aisle, but I think that going more into the organic section, you're going to have a much safer bet than you would otherwise.
Okay, and last one, do you have a recommendation for a specific whole food based multivitamin?
Yes, I do have some recommendations. For my kids, I actually do Nordic Naturals. There's some other good gummies, but you know, kids do like the gummies, and this one is a pretty good one. So I usually get them Nordic Naturals, and that's a really good brand. The one I personally take is New Chapter. I do like that one because I feel that there's some herbal blends as well in New Chapter, so you kind of have to be careful about that. But it is usually blended for a specific person, so they really kind of separate it out for men and women and then age groups as well. So I think that they can be super helpful, and it's a good vitamin. The other one I do like, Garden of Life. They have My Kind Organic, and that one's also a very good vitamin. I do like based vitamins, I will say that, because you know, if the nutrients are not bound in the way that our body recognizes it as food, we're not going to absorb it as well. So if it's a compounded vitamin like Centrum and GNC, although they can still have benefit, I don't feel that they are as well absorbed as the whole food-based vitamins.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Ridgley, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just thank you very much for listening, and I hope that this was helpful.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I know this probably wasn't what you expected to learn tonight, but I hope you still got a good amount of information from it. I do ask before you exit, if you're still in Slido, to leave us some feedback at the feedback survey. It's just 6 questions, super quick, super easy, and it will be very helpful in helping us to continue improving this program. Again, just to reiterate, this webinar, recording of this webinar will be posted on the DCSD YouTube channel. And as people who registered and attended, you will receive a direct link from me. Other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you at another webinar.